based on the three sisters, which is corn, beans, and squash. And these three sisters, we call them that because we plant them together and they grow together and support each other. So this is kind of like the polar opposite of the monoculture farming that you see today in commercial farming. Monoculture farming means they're planting one crop at a time in one area. So you see like huge fields of corn or canola or whatever else they're growing. Only growing one crop at a time means that that crop is going to need a lot of assistance, right? It needs pesticides to keep bugs away from it. It needs fertilizer to fertilize the soil. It needs all of these different chemicals added in. And monoculture farming strips a lot of the nutrients out of the soil without putting anything back in, right? Because you've got one type of crop taking everything that it needs out of that soil. If you want to plant corn again in that same field, you're going to have to add all that stuff back in a synthetic way for the corn to have what it needs to grow, right? That's monoculture farming. It strips everything out of the soil and gives nothing back. The way our ancestors planted foods was a more regenerative form of agriculture. And I encourage you to check out the teaching garden over there because they actually have an example growing that you can see of the way that our ancestors planted things symbiotically. So the Three Sisters planting method is where you plant corn in the center, you let it grow a little bit until it's about 6 inches tall, and then you plant your beans and squash around it. By the time the corn is tall enough to support the bean vines are reaching out for something to grab onto. A lot of people grow beans and they got to grow them on a fence or put up a trellis. If you plant corn with beans, the corn is the trellis. So the beans grow up the corn and use it as support for the vines. And they also are a legume. So the beans are able to pull nitrogen out of the air and fix it into the soil through their roots, thereby fertilizing the soil and giving their own nutrients to the other sisters. And then the squash is what we plant around the outside base. Squash has these huge, huge leaves. You'll see them over there. They're bigger than my hands, and they keep the soil moist. They keep the moisture in, and they have these little hairs, prickly hairs on the bottom of the leaves that keep pests out, so they keep the roots of the plants safe. So you've got everything you need for these plants to take care of each other, just the way that sisters do. And I've been telling everybody this week, we have this little rhyme that will get stuck in your head, I promise. If they grow together, they go together. So these plants that we grow together, we cook them together. We've got Three Sisters stews, soup, dips, salads. We harvest them all at the same time. They're all ready to go, and we preserve them in much the same way. We dry our beans, we dry our corn, and we even dry the squash to preserve it over the winter time. We harvest all of this over the summer, and then we have it to eat all year round. So right now, I've got fresh squash, and we're going to use fresh squash. What our ancestors would do to preserve this is cut it into very thin rings, all different kinds of squash. You know, you might see like, I don't know what, acorn, butternut, pumpkins in the fall, and then maybe like this is a kabocha squash. You've got 4 different kinds of squash that you might be able to find at the store. Our ancestors, I know my Cherokee ancestors alone I've got seeds for at least 6 different kinds of squash, just from my Appalachian homeland, whose seeds were saved and passed down to me. And every different tribe has all of those different diverse varieties of, what you would think of as heirloom squash. Same for our corn. Every different tribe has all of these different corn that they identify with. This is a blue corn from the southwestern region that I'm using today. So we have all of these diverse, different types of these Three Sisters that we grow, and each of them have different levels of nutrients, different layers of micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, everything that they add to our diet. That diversity is something that we are missing in our modern grocery stores. This is why farmers markets and gardens and community gardens are so important. Amen. To reintroduce that diversity, because that is where we truly can find that physical wellness, is by diversifying our diets. So I'm going to get in and start this, and then while our soup kind of works on the stove, I'll start to tell you a little bit about the Cherokee concept of wellness and health, because it's a little different than maybe the Western medicine viewpoint. First thing I'm starting with is my meat. I've got a nice cast iron pot. If any of y'all don't have a cast iron at home, go buy one right now as soon as I'm done, because this is really the only way to go. If you're doing things like cooking stews, browning meats, it holds in the heat and keeps it evenly dispersed so that you get really good browning, and browning is where the flavor comes from in this recipe. This is where we're making our own broth in this pot. We don't have to have stock, we don't have to have any of that. It all happens in the pot at one time. So usually I would be using venison for this recipe. I have a hunter who I'm friends with at home that keeps me pretty well supplied, but one thing that I really like to encourage and, point out to people is that one of the most important things is to meet y'all where you're at. So if you don't have venison at home, or if buying lamb or some kind of grass-fed beef is really expensive and prohibitive to you doing this, get whatever kind of stew meat you can afford. Get whatever you got. Make it without the meat. It's delicious as a vegetarian dish. The most important thing is that we're cooking, that we're putting intention into the food we're making, that we're buying the best ingredients that we can in the position that we're in. So I've got my meat, and I'm going to season it with this. This is kind of my proprietary top secret spice blend, but it's not that much of a secret because the recipe's on the back of your chair. So I call it uteri. And in Cherokee language, if something was really delicious or really good and you're sitting around eating it, you'd be like, uteri, uteri. So that's what this is. It's going to make everything that I put it on absolutely delicious. And it's a wild seasoning blend. So I've got ground juniper, ground spice bush berry, ground sumac, some maple sugar to bring out a little bit of that sweetness in the meat, some smoked salt to add real smoky depth, and then what else is in there? That's it. So the juniper has this kind of piney flavor. Juniper is one of the main ingredients like in gin. So if you ever drink gin and that like pine kind of fruity flavor, that's juniper. It goes excellent with game meats because, again, if it grows together, it goes together, right? We're thinking about forest flavors here. This stew is going to end up giving us that taste of a place because we're harvesting sumac berries and spice bush berries that there's a foraging tent over there with Rachel West and Bo Brown, and they have examples of all of these wild seasonings that I'm using. They're giving you the flavor of where this deer lives, so it's all going to go together and complement each other. So I'm mixing that up, making sure each piece is nice and coated. I add the oil to the meat so that each piece is coated so that it doesn't stick and we get some really good browning, as opposed to putting the oil in my pan where it'll probably scorch. We'll probably use way more than we need because that's easy to do unless you're just trying to coat the outside of the meat just enough for it not to stick. And I'm going to be so heavy-handed with this stuff because it's really good. Basically, these spices are all going to toast along with the meat while I cook it. And got my pot on pretty high here. One of the important things to know when you're browning meat is always start with a really hot pan. If you put your meat in there and you don't hear it sizzle, your pan's too cold. And it's going to be really hard for you to get that brown by cranking the heat up in the pan, because then what you're going to do is draw all the moisture out of the meat before the browning happens. So it's important. Even if your pan is smoking, the heat will dissipate as soon as I put this meat in there. So you're not going to burn it if your pan is maybe a little over hot. You can just adjust that as you go. So I'm going to add this in. Now, this is about 3/4 of a pound of meat because we're making kind of a mini version of the recipe today. Usually, honestly, the whole time we've been here, the hardest part for me has been making this size of a bowl of a pot soup. I'm usually like cooking over a fire in my pot I can actually take a bath in. So this is an adjustment for me. But the most important thing about putting your meat in this pan, aside from that pan being hot when you start, is not to overcrowd your pan. Make sure you're using the mirror up here to see what I'm doing, because you can see there's lots of space between each of my pieces of meat. I could fit a little bit more on there, but you really only want to add enough to fit the bottom layer of the pan. So if that means you have to take all of this out, put it on a plate to collect the juices, and then do a second round of browning, do that. Because if you've ever put too much meat in a pan, you'll see what happens. You get that like kind of gray, bleh. It's gonna taste fine if you do that because you're in a hurry. Don't throw it away, you know, it's fine, but you're not gonna get the browning that we want here. And the browning is where all that flavor comes from again. So we're gonna brown this in the pot here. And I'm gonna try my hardest not to move it until it gets a nice good crust. That's the other thing is these cast iron pots are pretty much non-stick if they're seasoned right, and if you let your beef or venison or whatever you're cooking, even chicken, if you just let it sit and brown, it will release itself when it's ready, and then you're not gonna have it all torn to the bottom of your pot. And what you're gonna get is really nice brown bits that in the French culinary tradition is called fond, but we just call it good brown bits. So keep your good brown bits in there, and then when it's ready to turn, you'll kind of flip it all over, and you'll see all these flavorful brown spots on your meat, and you'll see it's kind of sticking on the bottom of the pan too. So we'll let that brown up a little bit, and I'm gonna get this onion ready. You guys are in for a treat because I think you're the first time out of every day that I've been making this stew that I remembered to put the garlic in it. So in the recipe, I think it says something like maybe 2 tablespoons of garlic, 2 cloves of garlic. Anytime I say 2 or 3 cloves of garlic in a recipe, I really mean like 5 to 7 to 10 to a handful, however much you want. Another, great thing about cooking for yourself is that you can make those decisions. You can put as much garlic as you want. If you're not a garlic person, you can omit it, that's fine. About indigenous food that I like to make note of is that there's no waste that happens anywhere. So you'll notice I've carefully hoarded my little onion peels over here. You can compost, composting is great, but with stuff like this, I keep it, all the ends of my onions, all the peels of my onions, the tops of my green onions, the tops of my carrots, the peels of my carrots, the ugly celery or the, brown parts that you cut off, and I keep a bag in the freezer. That stuff is gold. I keep, I've got basically a whole freezer full of these Ziploc bags of scraps, anything that would be good in a stock pot, like your parsley stems, things like that too. Even some garlic, if it starts to get a little spotty, I'll keep that, put it in my stock pot. And then any bones from like if I do roast chicken or something like that. If I roast pork shoulder, I keep those little shoulder blade bones, and I keep them in that bag. And then when I'm ready to make a soup and I want to make a stock for it, I've got all of the fixings just ready right there, and nothing goes to waste because all of this is flavor everywhere we go. So I'm just doing a real rough chop on this garlic. So I like to have big chunks. And got in our pot just right brown bits on the bottom. Now we're going to add our onions. And these onions are going to sweat and release their juices. And those juices are going to start to bring that brown stuff off the bottom of the pot. So we're adding caramelization to the onions, but we're also kind of using the juice to scrape up our little bits. And I realize there's always one thing that I forget. I remembered the garlic today, but I forgot the water. Would you mind grabbing like a pot of water, just enough for here, like 3 quarts? Thank you. So we're gonna let this brown in here. Once it gets a little cooler, I'm going to add my garlic. Garlic tends to burn faster than onions, so I always put them in a little bit after the onions. That's all ready to go. And while this kind of works in here, I'm going to talk to you about how we've prepared this corn. So corn is that oldest sister, supports all of the younger sisters, and it's really one of the cornerstones of our food as Cherokee people. We're corn people. And if you were here yesterday, you might have seen the demonstration that I did for hominy making. This is the hominy that I made yesterday. So we start with this blue corn right here. It's very hard, just dried flour corn or field corn. So it's real starchy in the middle, really hard and powdery. Thank you. Perfect. And then it's got this hard outer shell on the outside, right? It's got this hull. And human beings can't digest this outer hull on the corn. So we have to do something to it to be able to kind of unlock all of its nutrients. And the technique that our ancestors pioneered is the chemical process of nixtamalization. So we take hardwood ash, again, nothing going to waste. This is the ash from our cook fires. We're always using hardwood like hickory or walnut or pecan to cook over because it creates really good coals, it burns really hot, and it burns for a long time, which is great for cooking and for keeping ourselves warm. So that's what we always cook with. And the ash that's left over, we sift that and we save it. And you add this corn, 1 part corn, 1 part of that wood ash, and you simmer it in clean water. And this process happens where the alkali properties of that ash, it's got a really high pH. That's another reason why you use hardwood ash, because it has a higher pH content. So we create this alkali solution with ash and water, and we're able to kind of make this sludgy slurry, and we simmer the corn in that, and this reaction happens where the outer hull of the corn starts to soften to the point that we can slip it off. We wash and rinse all of that outer hull off once it's been softened in that kind of basically a lye solution that we've made from natural ingredients, and what we're left with is this. So this doesn't look like the hominy that you get in the can, does it? Not at all. That stuff is all pretty uniform. It's got somewhat of a flavor that a lot of people really don't care for. You know, there's so many people that I've talked to that said, I don't like hominy. And I come back at them in probably too aggressive of a way, and I say, that's because you never had hominy. This is what real hominy is supposed to taste like. You know, the hominy that they make in those commercial, canning factories and stuff, they're using a kind of more refined method of doing the hominy process using just straight lime. And then the canning process just kind of leaches all of the good stuff out of it. You know, there's nothing wrong with using refined lime to make hominy, and I do it quite often because it's a lot easier to clean than washing all of the ash sludge off of this. But there is a certain amount of flavor that gets added to the corn when you do it in that ancestral, that really old way. And the resulting corn, whether you do it with kal, or which is the lime that's been refined, or you do it in this old way, you get a corn that still has all of its kind of broth-giving qualities. So when we add this to the pot, it's going to give this really roasty, sweet, toasted corn flavor to our broth that you can't get from using canned corn. So I'm going to turn this pan down just a little bit and add our water. So this, again, in the culinary tradition, is what we would call deglazing. Sometimes people do that with like brandy or, some kind of a broth. That's good, but you can see already that we've got a pretty good looking broth in here as is. This is just from the brown bits and the seasoning from the outside of that meat and the caramelization of the onions. And this is a really crucial step when you're making a stew like this, because I'm scraping up, this is all the flavor. I don't want to leave any of the flavor on the bottom of that pot. It's also pretty much doing my dishes right now, because once you scrape up all the brown bits from the bottom of this pot, you're really just going to have to rinse out and wipe out your cast iron when you're done, and you'll be good to go for the next batch. So I can kind of feel with my wooden spoon. There's really nothing better than a wooden spoon to scrape up brown bits from the bottom of a cast iron pan. It just feels right. And I can feel that the bottom of my pan is pretty much clean, so I'm going to add the rest of my broth at that point. Or the rest of my water. Fill that up. And then we'll add our hominy, and we'll add some black beans. So this hominy, when we do the hominy process, I've stopped it to the point where it's still pretty hard. We've taken this outer hull off, but it's not cooked through. So it's going to cook at about the same time it takes to cook these beans that have been soaked. So we're going to stir those in together. And this is just gonna simmer. And basically right around the time that that beef is tender enough, or whatever stew meat you're using is tender enough to fall apart, your beans are gonna be cooked all the way through, and your corn is gonna be nice and chewy. It gets kind of this al dente texture where it's got a little bit of a bite in the center, but it's kind of chewy and soft on the outside. Another great thing about cooking from either making your own hominy, or you can cook dried hominy that you can buy in the store, is that you get a really good texture from it. The canned hominy is always going to be kind of squishy, doesn't have as much of that bite, and if you cook it like this, it's going to kind of just disappear, you know, from being in that can and being processed that way. But cooking it this way from dried hominy or from hominy you make yourself, you still retain that texture, which is really pleasant. And then while that simmers, I'm going to get my squash ready. So this is a kabocha squash. We've got, like I said, tons of different types of squash in Cherokee country. One of them that is my favorite is the Georgia candy roaster squash. If you ever see that in a seed catalog, get it. They're enormous. We love to grow them, and then we have what's called Cherokee National Holiday around Labor Day weekend when we're harvesting all of our stuff, and it's kind of a homecoming where we all get together and we have dances and we have like cultural exhibits. That's in our kind of capital city of Tahlequah, Oklahoma. If you're ever in the neighborhood, come and see us, and you can see these Georgia candy roasters that are like this long and this big around, and we call them candy roasters because they're great in stew and soup and things like that, but they're even better in like a casserole or a pie because they have this natural sweetness and this bright orange color. But really any kind of winter squash that you want to use would be good for this. Like acorn squash I love, and kabocha squash I also really like using because I don't have to peel this. A lot of people are, you know, intimidated by buying this whole thing, like what am I going to do with this thing? This is going to be a pain. With butternut squash or pumpkin or something like that, it's got like a really tough kind of crunchy outer shell that never really softens in a pot. So you would want to peel that. But with this kabocha squash, or if you were using something like acorn squash, I'm just cutting it up with the skin on it. And like I was talking about earlier, we waste nothing, right? So you'll find that in a lot of indigenous recipes, or if you're like cooking with a Cherokee grandma, we don't peel our potatoes, we don't peel our carrots, we don't we don't peel our squash if we don't have to, because there's a lot of fiber and nutrients in here, and there's just no reason to waste it. It's going to get to where this is really kind of creamy on the bottom, and then it'll have this bite that keeps your squash in pieces together in the pot. So it kind of has its own role to play in there. So I'm kind of cutting big chunks of this, and it's going to be a good 2, maybe even 3 hours of this simmering on the stove for that stew meat to get nice and soft. Using something like beef, it'll take a little bit longer because it has more like connective tissue, it's got more fat in there. Something leaner like venison is going to have a quicker cooking time. The beans and the corn in this can stand up to however long it's going to take your beans. So this is the kind of thing where you can just have that on the pot, simmering all day, making your house smell incredible, giving you a good feeling. And then when it's ready, when the corn and the beans are done, then you'll add your squash. And then what you'll end up with is a delicious dish that looks like this. And I like to garnish this maybe with some fresh things, fresh herbs or things that I have from the garden like that. If I were making this in the springtime, I might throw some wild onions on top of there. In the winter, maybe there's some like wintertime herbs that you have planted. But we've got really soft squash going on in there that keeps its vibrant color, and the meat is fall apart tender. And then you've got this broth that has all of the nutrients from that corn, from the beans, all added in there together. And you can see the corn and the beans kind of hold their shape, so nothing's getting mushy in there. They really stand up to a long time of cooking. So this is the kind of thing that we would make, and we would just have it on the stove all day. You just come and you get you a bowl whenever you're hungry, and it stays there, you know. This is something that we would make at camp, you know, when we get together and have our dances or have our, you know, community gatherings, or we have ceremonies. This is a food that we would make. But it's not just for ceremony. It's not, you know, it's something that is a part of our everyday life. And that's something that I want to touch on while we have everything simmering here, is this concept of wellness that differs a little bit from the Western idea of wellness, which often wellness is thought of as just the absence of disease, right? But, you know, there's nothing afflicting you or ailing you right now, so you're well, right? But that's not necessarily the way we see it in Cherokee culture, and this goes for a lot of different indigenous cultures. The idea of wellness is a more holistic one, where it encompasses more than just your physical being. So, can I get a time check? To make sure I'm not going over for anybody. 15? Okay, perfect. So I want to tell you this story that will kind of put in context these foods that we're eating. So our indigenous people, our Cherokee people, have this story of the origin of plant medicine, because our concept of medicine involves not just, you know, something that you take when you're sick. Food is medicine. All of these plants are medicine, and we eat them not just when we're sick, but we eat them all the time, and that's a way of maintaining our wellness. But plants weren't always medicine for us. At the very beginning of the world, we had our animals and our plants, and we all lived on the land, sharing the water, and everybody was in a peaceful balance. And humans were relatively new to the world. You know, the plants and the animals had been here for a very long time. They knew how things worked. Humans were this new addition that showed up, and they're kind of seen as like the little brother or sister, because we needed a lot of help. The animals saw that we were these kind of pitiful, cold little creatures without any fur on our bodies. How were we supposed to survive the winter? So the animals would give of themselves, of their own fur, to keep us warm. And the plants saw that, you know, we always needed things to eat. The animals saw that we needed things to eat and couldn't produce our own from taking from the water or taking from the sky. And so the animals and plants decided to give of themselves to help us survive and thrive by nutrition. And so we all lived in this balance for a long time. And this balance is what we call tohi. And the word tohi is kind of a root word. So if I were to meet you on the street, I would say, Osio tohichu, which in English is translated to, hello, how are you? That's like the first thing you learn when you're learning a language, right? Is hello, my name is blah, how are you? But in Cherokee, this has such a deeper meaning, because, you know, we're asking, how are you, as in, are you well? But what we're really asking is, are you in a good relationship with everything around you? Are you in a good relationship with the people, the land, the animals, the plants, everything in your realm? Are you moving forward in a peaceful forward motion in good excuse me, in good relation to the land that you're on? So we liken this to like a stream flowing in the mountains. If there's lots of rocks and if it's very steep, the land that this stream is flowing over, the stream is going to be flowing really fast. If the land is pretty flat, the stream is going to be moving a little slower. But it's always moving at exactly the right pace for where it is in relation to everything around it. That water always moves in a forward motion. That's wellness to us. So this wellness is a good relationship with everything around us and always moving in a peaceful forward motion. And this is the way things were at the beginning. But humans have something that animals and plants don't have, and that is ego. And this ego often gets us in trouble. So humans started to lose sight of the gifts that these animals and plants were giving them, and started to think that they were entitled to these things, that everything revolved around them, and that they were somehow more important, that their needs were more important, that their desires were more important than those of the animals and the plants. And so they started taking more than they needed, and they started taking trophies of the animals and wasting the gifts that the animals were giving them. And the animals were understandably very upset by this. So they went to Creator and said, you know, this has upset our balance of tohi. We are not thriving, and our numbers are dwindling to the point where we might not even be here for much longer if something isn't done. What can we do to check these human beings? And so what Creator did was send down all of these illnesses. And before this point, there had never been so much as a headache or, you know, stomach ache or anything like that. Humans were just living happily. But now there were all of these diseases, and it was things like headaches and stomach aches and a little common cold here and there. And then it started to be things like heart disease and arthritis and things that made it so that the human beings could not survive. They couldn't work, they couldn't build things, they couldn't support themselves, and they all started to die. And the plants saw this and were very compassionate. And this is what we know about our plant relatives, is that we don't hear them talking a lot because they're always listening. They listen more than they talk. And that's why they know so much. That's something that we can learn from them. Something I could probably learn, because I talk a lot. I try to listen as much as I talk, like my plant ancestors do. But they saw the suffering of the humans and they wanted to help. So they went to Creator and said, how can we help ease the suffering of the humans, but also remind them of their place in this balance? And so Creator gave the gift of medicine to each and every one of these plants. So each plant has the power to heal something that is ailing the human beings. But there's a caveat to that, right? We can't just go out into a field and pick any grass when we have a headache and eat it and feel better. In fact, that's a really good way to feel much, much worse and potentially really do some lasting harm to yourself. You have to be in a relationship with the plants to be able to receive the gift that they have to give you. So if you think about people in your life that you have a relationship with, maybe that's your best friend or your mother or your sibling, or even the person that delivers your mail. You know things about those people. You have a relationship with them. I know that my mother is a summertime person. She doesn't like those dreary days. She likes to be out in the hot sun. And I know what she likes to eat. I know who she likes to hang out with. I know who her friends are. I know who she does not particularly care for. Those are all things that you know about someone that you're in a relationship with. Those are things that you can know about plants, because you can have a relationship with plants in the same way and have that same respect that you have for plants that you do for the people in your life. Because the people in your life, you care about them, you know about them, and so you want to do things for them that make them feel good and that take care of them, and you want to make sure that they have what they need to thrive. Imagine if we were in a relationship with all of the plants and animals that were giving us these gifts of sustenance. If we were able to take care of them in that relationship, that reciprocity, if we were able to take care of them the same way that they take care of us, then we probably wouldn't be in the situation that we're in as far as the climate goes. Our planet is suffering of the fact that these are gifts that the world, gifts are a responsibility. They're not just free. That's something that is different between the indigenous perspective and kind of the modern, capitalist perspective that we have here, is that a lot of times we look at things like they are just there for the taking, that they're a commodity. If we changed our mindset from a commodity mindset to a gift perspective, then something that you buy at the store, you don't have any obligation to that item. You bought it and it's yours, and you can do whatever you want with it. If something is a gift, you cherish it and you take care of it and you make sure that it lasts, and you make sure you take care of the place where that gift came from so that it can give gifts in the future. That's the relationship, and that's the reciprocity that comes when you cook indigenous foods and you make choices like buying a squash from an organic producer at your local farmer's market, or growing your own from an heirloom seed, or buying from, or visiting or supporting a community garden in the neighborhood. There are benefits to eating these types of gifts that you can't get from the stuff that you buy at the store. And that's that wellness that we're talking about that goes beyond physical wellness. So briefly, I'll talk about that. The concept of wellness, we've talked about Dohi. We have what we call the medicine wheel. And it's a great way to check in when you're making food or when you're buying food, or just in your everyday life, to see where you're at in a state of wellness. How are you doing physically? Yes. That's where you talk about the absence of disease. My body feels good. Nothing's, harming me. I don't feel the need to, make some sort of tea to give me an energy boost, or, anything like that. But there's also mental wellness, spiritual wellness, and emotional wellness. this is the balance of wellness that we look to when we're making indigenous foods, because these foods have the power to, yes, give us physical strength because they're more nutrient dense than a lot of the commercially produced foods that we can get. When we're cooking from scratch, we're not adding in a bunch of preservatives and things like that that take away from the nutrient content of our foods. But we're also introducing spiritual elements, mental, elements, where the act of holding this spoon and stirring this pot makes me feel really good. It calms me. I'm able to put intention into this so that I know that the energy I'm putting in when I share this with people, they're going to pick up on that. When you cook processed foods, you're not really able to put that into the food, but the act of creating something with raw ingredients, you're, in its nature, putting this energy into it that is healing in ways beyond just the physical nutrient content that's in this pot. So with that, I would love to, we've got just a couple minutes. If anybody has any questions about what we've talked about, yes, sir.
I'm from Miami. I just wonder if there's any place in Tulsa or Tahlequah or any place else in Northeast Oklahoma that your part of the world, our part of the world, where you can eat like this, eat these recipes, eat this food. You work in a restaurant.
I do not have a restaurant, but I do private catering work, so I'll give you a business card later. You can get the link there and hit me up if you ever need any events or anything like that. But we do pop-up dinners at our wellness center. We're on Brookside in Tulsa, and we're kind of all over the place in northeastern Oklahoma. So you'll find us at events in Tahlequah, we go to Miami, and in that part of the country, in that part of the state, in Miami, you're actually pretty close to Veneta. There's a welcome center, the Cherokee Nation Anna Mitchell Cultural and Welcome Center, which Anna Mitchell is one of our Cherokee National Treasures for pottery. If you're ever in northeastern Oklahoma, go to Veneta. It's a beautiful new welcome center that we have. And I actually have some grab-and-go foods that are made with traditional ingredients, and they're kind of, we've got like squash and Appalachian allspice or spiced bushberry spiced muffins there. We've got different types of trail mix, and we've got a Three Sisters dip that we serve there. So that's a good place if you want to pick up some food that we've made and you're in that area. But I also will tell you that all the recipes for everything I make, everyone's always like, is that a top secret recipe or something? Nothing is a secret here. I want everybody to know how to make this stuff, because that's important. The more people out here cooking like this and supporting indigenous food producers and supporting local organic and non-GMO farmers, the more we can invest into those types of agriculture methods. And these foods heal us, but they also heal the earth. All the benefits that we're getting in our bodies and that we're getting emotionally and mentally and spiritually from cooking in a good way is a good way for the earth as well. So we're healing the earth at the same time as we're healing ourselves. And that's the balance, right? That's the ultimate lesson in this, is that if we're eating foods that are just taking from the land, it's not giving us anything. If we're eating foods that are giving back to the land in a good way so that the land is there to provide for future generations, we are going to be healthy to provide for future generations. Yes?
You had mentioned that you can do this as you mentioned that you can do this as a vegetarian dish. What's the source of your brown bits replacement in that case?
You would have the caramelization of the onion and garlic on the bottom of that pot, but really the broth, that using like a good quality heirloom dried bean, mainly a fresh bean, is the key. You wouldn't think of like dried beans as something that could be fresh. They're not ever going to go bad, but you're going to get a more flavorful broth from a really good quality, locally or organically grown bean. So that's going to create its own broth, and then the corn itself has a really flavorful broth. So you don't even really need the meat there. You're going to get a lot of flavor just from dried corn and the squash itself too. But I will tell you, this, even with the meat or without the meat, vegetarian or not, I love to take this recipe and drop a big handful of tender greens in it. And that is excellent too. Adds that extra fiber, extra iron, all of the good stuff that comes with a nice dark leafy green. You could take you know, in the springtime, some dandelion greens, drop that in there. Like I said, wild onions, drop that in there. Right at the end of cooking. If you're in the summertime and you want to use summer squash or something like that to drop in here and add a little extra vegetable bulk to it, you can do that as well. A lot of people think they don't like zucchini also. I say to you, you haven't had zucchini cooked right. Because it's a textural thing, I think, for a lot of people. If you just put zucchini in at the end of this cooking and just let it sit there, you do not need to simmer it or anything like that. It'll absorb just the right amount and have a bite to it, and it'll be delicious in the stew. So that's something that you can play with, is anything that you have seasonally. That's how our ancestors would do it. We've got our Three Sisters staples. We've always got dried squash, or, you know, these days we freeze our squash, or dried beans, dried hominy, things like that as our base. But you can always supplement it with the things that are seasonal, that give you the seasonal benefits that you need. The earth gives us the medicine that we need when we need it, right? So in the fall time, we're using extra things like that are full of antioxidants and immune boosting properties in time for cold and flu season. In the springtime, we're adding these young greens that have lots of diuretic properties that flush our bodies of toxins. All of those things come right when you need them. So that's one of the most important things about, and one of the big benefits of eating seasonally, is these foods that come about at the time of year that they come, they're there for a reason. They're going to give you just the nutrients that you need when you need it. And this is a good base recipe to chunk in all that good seasonal stuff and get the benefits. And it's easy enough to, you know, use this as a base and put in anything that you think would taste good. Yeah.
How much of a movement is this becoming in the Native community? How much is it catching on since you've been doing this work?
It's huge and wonderful and beautiful and growing every day. It's the food sovereignty movement. And food sovereignty, you know, sovereignty is kind of one of those concepts that people really, you know, it's hard to latch onto. The sovereignty is our ability as Indigenous people to feed ourselves foods that are culturally supportive, culturally relevant, and that heal us in a way that connects us to our ancestors. Just as sovereignty in a legal sense is that we are sovereign nations on this land with the rights according to the treaties that we signed with the US federal government to govern ourselves. We have the power to govern ourselves on our own sovereign lands. Food sovereignty is the power to feed our communities with foods that our ancestors left behind for us in a way to heal us. So it's a huge movement, and it's so important because we really don't separate the food sovereignty from the political sovereignty, or, you know, the food from the medicine. It's all connected. You know, our foods tie us to our basket weaving crafts, our finger weaving, the clothes that we make, the ceremonies that we do are all tied to the land that we're on and the foods that the land gives us. So holding on to these traditions as, you know, sovereign nations allows us to retain our culture and pass it to future generations. So it's an enormous undertaking, but it's a beautiful movement at the same time. So I encourage you, you know, if you're from here or if you're from back in the Ozarks or wherever you're from, find out whose land you're on and find where those tribes are operating their headquarters out of. A lot of them will have seed saving programs where they are collecting ancestral seeds like these, like what I cook with, that are tied directly to their history. You know, every tribe that is our corn people have their own corn. Cherokee people have white eagle corn that was first grown, you know, thousands and thousands of years ago in the Appalachians, and was sewn into the hems of our ancestors' skirts and brought along the Trail of Tears, and we still grow that corn today. That's powerful. That's powerful stuff, and it's important that we get future generations. That's the food sovereignty movement too, is getting future generations to value and understand the meaning of cooking that corn instead of some other corn is a way to connect us to our ancestors. So I think that's the time I got to get out of the way for the next presenter. But thank you so much. Please connect with me on social media, find these recipes. I'm happy to share them.
Thank you.